first National Trans Visibility March took place on September 28, 2019 in Washington, D.C. With over 5,300 attendees, this historic event brought together both transgender individuals and allies from all over the United States.
We are tired of fighting for our country on foreign soil and then being told that we are no longer fit to serve. We are tired of our murders going without any justice and our murderers out there free. We want to be free, and that's why we are here.
I want you to repeat after me. I am here. I am here. Yes, ma'am.
We need to take back our narrative. We are not victims. We are not statistics. We are not tragedies. We are waiting to thrive, and this is our best year yet, because we aren't here simply to be visible. We are here to be victorious. So when we move forward today, let us press forward with purpose, let us press forward with passion, and let us know that the fight has just begun.
Hello, am I live? I seem to be live. Please disregard the loud dog. We just adopted her. She has some anxiety issues. Trixie, come. Trixie, come and I'll pet you while I talk. So I am Victoria Rodriguez Rodan. I am the Senior Policy Manager at AIDS United. And you're watching Ending the AIDS Epidemic in the United States by 2025. So what are we talking about when we talk about that? That is essentially the goal of AIDS United. That is the organization's stated goal, which is essentially end the HIV epidemic in the United States. We believe at this point, Trixie, come. And I am so sorry, my friends, about this. Trixie, come and I'll pet you. But you need to calm down. The neighbors don't like you because of this. So what does this mean? It means as we have moved forward from the depths of the worst of the HIV epidemic in the 1980s, when an HIV diagnosis was a death sentence in every way, it meant that we needed to move forward in advances. We needed to move forward in making those advances a reality. But to get there, we also need to acknowledge the intersectionality of HIV and how it impacts LGBTQ people, especially trans people. That means that we have, by definition, the entire idea of Audre Lorde that talks about how we do not lead single issue lives and thus we cannot do single issue advocacy. So what does this mean? We like to talk about how HIV is no longer a problem in a way, and many LGBT organizations have sort of moved beyond it in a way, now that it is in many ways a more manageable condition. And we are finally having a generation that is aging, with a large portion of the people living with HIV population being over the age of 50 and 60, which tells us about the triumph and resiliency of the community. So this still, however, we still have a major epidemic when we look at the marginalized communities of the country that are left behind, at the people who have built this country for free and yet still not included when we talk about what is America. For example, 42% of new HIV diagnoses, of the new 2018 diagnoses, and there were 37,832 new HIV diagnoses in the US and dependent areas, and 42% of them were among adult and adolescent blacks and blacks or African Americans. Please give me 1 second before I am made insane. Trixie. With a treat. Sorry about that. I had to bribe my dog with a treat. And so what does this mean? 31% were among men, African American men. That tells us among Black people in America, we still are in the depths of the HIV epidemic, even as we have tools like PrEP, which are some of the best weapons we have in ending the epidemic, and yet are inaccessible if you don't have the right insurance or if you don't have the right access to coverage, which the COVID epidemic has made even more difficult at times. When we think about that racial makeup, we also think about how it intersects in poverty. For example, 42% of people living with HIV, I'm forgetting if it's 41% or 42%, rely on Medicaid, under states' Medicaid, for the purpose of using of HIV coverage, for their healthcare coverage, instead of on private insurance, compared to like 13 to 15% of the general US population. Given that Medicaid is primarily made for people under low income, under a certain income, that alone tells you a lot of who is the most vulnerable for HIV. So, what are the things that we need to end the epidemic when we have 38,000 cases every year in 2018 alone, and 42% are among Black people, for example, with cities with the largest Black population, like the District of Columbia, being among those that have the highest incidence rates, infection rates in the world. So what we do then is that we need to address the causes and vulnerabilities. We need to address situations like, for example, access to healthcare. We also need to address issues like the affordability of healthcare. It is not enough to talk about PrEP if it's not accessible, if it's not affordable to all. If you live in a rural area where the most understanding doctor is far away from you, that is knowledgeable about HIV, you're not going to get access to PrEP. If you don't have the right insurance, if you're completely uninsured or have faced barriers accessing Medicaid, especially in the states that haven't done the Medicaid expansion, you still face those barriers. you can't afford PrEP, and I can keep on going. And that's without even going into all the issues of how the various pharmaceutical companies like Gilead maintain their patents and thus the high costs of Truvada and Descovy, which are the medications used in this. So the other thing, and thus we need to consider all the healthcare reforms initiatives, which we had all over the issue of how we consider, for example, the topic of HIV in healthcare. We talked about during the Democratic primary issues like Medicare for all and other proposals, or Medicare for those who want it, or public options. And we need to consider this as a trans issue, which means access to trans healthcare, which means access to HIV healthcare, to prevention, and so on, making it universal for everyone, not just depending on who has access to afford copays or who has access to afford health insurance through their employer, or who is in the income bracket to have access to Medicaid instead of falling in that donut hole where you're supposedly too rich for Medicaid but too poor for to afford actual insurance through the marketplace or through your employer. Likewise, we have that issue when we think about other things like we need to think about, for example, and I'm sorry I keep swatting and my apartment is cursed and I keep having various problems, and now I'm having a fruit fly infestation. So I need to set up a fly trap or something. Yes, my apartment is cursed. I wish I had this were in person so I could make jokes about it. Um, and yes, I speak, and sorry about the dog, which happened earlier. But I can see your comments on Facebook, by the way. So if people have questions, stuff that you want me to address, by all means, go for it. So what do we think about? Like, for example, when we tie this to trans people, we think about the fact that 1 in 5 Black trans people, according to the US Trans Survey of 2015, live with HIV. And that's, again, 1 in 5. Those of you trans activists who are listening to me, think of 5 Black trans people, 5 Black trans women, and think 1 in 5 is likely to have HIV. That's literally the amount of people that fit in a car, probably in my car, and so on. So that is another thought. And we need to think of it as an inherently a trans issue, even though many organizations have neglected it. Why have we neglected HIV in the trans movement? Well, there are many reasons, but one of them is simply who is in the leadership. When I talk about intersectional advocacy, I like to say that when we sit in the rooms as a policy advocate, I often find myself before COVID in rooms in the Hill or in other policy spaces, or talking to heads of organizations, or talking to congressional staffers, or to people in agencies, and so on, that will try to be constantly working on this. Trixie, come. See if I can pet her and calm her down a little bit before the neighbor texts me complaining about the nonstop barking. Because this is normally the hour at which I start taking her out to the dog park. But instead, I'm talking to you, wonderful people, as part of this National Trans Visibility March of 2020. The second one, unfortunately, virtual because the world is falling apart. Hello, Trixie. I'd like to show her to you, but she's 50 pounds, so I'm not going to pick her up and put her in front of the camera. But she's a little hound, a Treeing Walker Coon hound. making her own voice heard, like we should have our voices heard as trans people, as trans women of color in this movement. Again, which goes to why the movement isn't as focused on the HIV issue among the trans community, which is simply put, many of the people leading trans advocacy right now aren't necessarily impacted by it or are affected by the realities of it, basically. And we think, and why am I going there? Like when we see high middle class or upper middle class, primarily white and so on, executive directors of organizations, or when we see no people with lived experience of who know what's it like to be on the edge of homelessness, or who know what's it like to have had to engage in an underground economy to survive, we are less likely to have those be priorities. That goes to the issue of who isn't in the room, of who are the people that are included in the policy making rooms. And far too often, we are making decisions without having the people actually impacted. The case of HIV, people living with it or who are at risk of it the most in these meetings and in the policy decision. Thus, we shouldn't be surprised that still practically a majority of the people are black or are of color, are the majority of people living with HIV are of color, that 1 in 5 black trans women have HIV, and so on. So what do we need to do to defeat the HIV epidemic? Well, we need to think about, and I always struggle to speak for such a lengthy amount of time, so people please give me questions in the thread. I don't know how many people are watching right now, but by all means, give me questions so I can answer them. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that we need to make the movement be aware of this, understand this issue. We need to move towards healthcare that is inclusive of all. We need to move towards issues that put us at risk. Sex work is work. We need to decriminalize sex work. I sit it proudly on the board of HIPS here in DC, which is an organization dedicated to harm reduction services for people engaging in sex work or drug use in DC. And we need more of that work. We need more policy work decriminalizing rather than saying, ooh, we aren't for those people, basically. We need more work that focuses on people living with disabilities, people living with trauma. As a disability advocate, I sometimes say that the LGBTQ experience, that the trans experience, is inherently disabling because of the trauma that comes with all the rest, with coming out, with discrimination, with systemic oppression that comes with it, and especially more those of us trans women of color. When we consider all the risks that we face in this society. So what else should we be thinking about? We need to think about the election. We are facing the election of our lifetimes. And one of the issues that is present at the Supreme Court right now is whether the Affordable Care Act will be upheld. Many governors right now, many states, and the administration, by the Trump administration, are trying to invalidate the Affordable Care Act before the U.S. Supreme Court. And we have potentially a new justice soon, and that further puts us at risk. Who knows how that will fare out? So we need an administration that will have greater understanding of healthcare policy, that will try to expand healthcare, or at the very least protect the Affordable Care Act. Because without the Affordable Care Act, we don't have pre-existing condition protections. People often complain, oh, the Affordable Care Act isn't that great. Premiums have gone up since then, so it hasn't solved the problem. It was just a band-aid. And all that's true. And little known fact that we often forget, the Affordable Care Act was supposed to just be a draft that was forced to be passed once Democrats lost the filibuster-proof majority with the special election in Massachusetts after Ted Kennedy died. So they were forced to ram that through into it. Trixie, calm down. Where are you now? Are you barking in front of the door that I locked so you wouldn't bark at the cat because you remember the cat exists? And she starts barking at the cat while the cat stares at her like, WTF is wrong with you? So, what else is there? Well, we need to think about, and I see the question of homeless communities. We need to provide every resource known to man. Well, we could solve literally the issue of homelessness. We could just give people housing. We could create universal basic income or other initiatives. But as a society, we essentially choose not to. And what does that mean? It means that we keep forgetting our most vulnerable amongst us. It means that we keep forgetting vulnerable, making it a privilege to survive. You have to pay money to literally survive in this capitalist society. So when you think about it, we need to also think about, oh, hey, the dog is finally sitting in her favorite chair, lying down. Perfect. That's exactly what I want you to do. So what does that mean? And sorry, I keep switching back and forth. I'm very untreated ADHD, but hey. So who are the people living at the margins of the margins? As my former intern Lydia Brown, the great Lydia Brown, has said, is people who are at risk of homelessness, people of color, people who can't afford even the joke that we make of, oh, I'm going to move to Canada if things get bad. People who can't afford that, people with disabilities. When we think about gun violence, we need to think about gun violence perpetrated by police, for example, and how 50% are 50% of people attacked by police, shot by police, are people living with disabilities, or of the majority of people incarcerated. And when we think of the trans movement, we need to think beyond just discrimination protections in employment. We need to think of beyond marriage, of how many people just thought the movement was gone by then, and so on. So what we need to think about, Trixie, why are you barking? Why are you woofing? Come on, stay with me so I can pet you. Come on, I'll pet you. I'll pet you while I talk. So what does this mean? Oh, she left. What does this mean? It means a greater issue around protecting. We need a trans movement that actually protects people. That when we talk about stakeholders, we aren't talking of we give you an Amazon gift card so that you could participate, and yay, we now have stakeholders and permission from the community. But without putting marginalized communities first and foremost, we won't get there to eradicate the HIV epidemic. So what is, now that we're approaching the half-hour mark, we need to mark into who is most vulnerable. That is Black trans people of color, who is most vulnerable to HIV, who is at most risk, people engaging in sex work, all the non-sexy parts of our community that we don't like putting on the stage of the DNC or in the policymaker meetings, in the Hill, in our lobby days, and so on. But we need to. We need to. I like to talk about the experience I had when I was advocating against a bad mental health bill. In the Hill, I was working at the National LGBTQ Task Force at the time, leading their new disability justice project that was happening. And I had just had this meeting with a chief of staff for a very progressive member of Congress, who shall remain unnamed, partly because I don't even remember the name of the congressperson. But the detail is the staffer told me, you need to understand we're talking about serious mental illness, people living with schizophrenia and bipolar. And you know how you sometimes come up with a comeback that you cannot possibly say no to saying it, even though it might get you into trouble. And I just said, you mean like me and my wife were both bipolar, who both have bipolar disorder. And then I got to spend the next 5 minutes watching that poor woman try to dig herself out of the hole that she had dug into. And in the process, digging herself even deeper into the hole because she was trying to say, oh, like, if it's well medicated or not like you, eventually essentially saying you're one of the good ones, basically. And that is a big problem within the trans movement and the HIV movement, where we still perceive this as a white gay person's disease, where we named the Ryan White program after a white young white child that died after a blood transfusion back when we were in screening blood transfusions before the epidemic, when the epidemic began. But we started, and when we had that happening, we keep screening out the non-sexy cases. Oh, we don't want to talk about sex work. It's stigmatized. We don't want to talk about drug use. We don't want to talk about needle exchanges and so on. But in reality, that's who we need to center first and foremost if we want to end the HIV epidemic by 2025, which is our goal. And the goal officially stated of the administration, which has a whole plan for ending the HIV epidemic at the same time as they're trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Don't ask me how that fits into human brain logic. I'm still struggling with it. I am approaching the 30-minute mark, so I'd like to hear questions from people. I would love to hear more questions. I don't know how many people are watching. So yeah. No questions? Come on, I love questions. I don't like being the only one to make a fool out of herself in front of a crowd. This I like to say in more in-person cases. Yes, Trixie, I'm gonna take you out once I'm done here. So yeah, I'm sorry about the dog, honestly. Marissa, Natalia Dupree, you've commented. I'm kind of waiting to hear more questions in the Facebook thread. Post your questions on the Facebook thread about how can we end the HIV epidemic in America by 2025, which is terrifyingly only 5 years from now, because there's the normal passage of time unless you have a time machine or a TARDIS. And if I had a TARDIS, you would never see me again, basically, because I wouldn't be in 2020. And frankly, giving webinars without questions feels like I'm a radio host, and that feels weird. So what does it mean? Latina has, how can we all help? Well, those of you who are activists, focus on centering marginalized communities as part of your discussion. Focus on bringing HIV as part of your portfolio when you talk about it. Focus on, again, the non-sexy issues. How are we helping um, people engaging in drug use, people engaging in sex work? How are we engaging the trans people that are literally passing each other $20 on Venmo every month to keep each other from starving before they get paid? And so on, which is a sad aspect of my Twitter account, the trans Twitter side of Twitter, that I keep seeing people literally begging for money to survive for their health care and stuff like that. And invariably, they're all trans. How can we help? Give money to those organizations. Don't give money to the big national orgs. Give money to organizations like HIPS or such. Give money to organizations like Red Umbrella Project, like the Positive Women's Network, which is focused around uh, women and trans people who are living with HIV. And I would make a shout out to Brianna Diaz, who used to be an HRC and is now at PWN, and is an amazing friend of mine. She's really rad. Um, that's one thing. Yeah, that's one thing to think about. Who we donate for, who we donate to, who we work with. When we think about, okay, we have people watching on Facebook. When we think about this, we need to think about how we have. Trixie, stop whimpering. I'll take you out soon, I promise. Uh, how can people of low socioeconomic status do to get PrEP or an equivalent? So there are various programs. If you are an HIV, it will be covered. The detail is getting that prescription, getting the doctor who will supervise it. There, I would encourage you to, and you can reach out. I would encourage you to reach out to the various gender-based clinics like Women Walker in DC, um, GMHC, and I'm forgetting their name. Audrey Lorde Prod? No, it's Kellen Lord in New York City, Chase Brexton in Baltimore, Fenway Health in Boston, and or Masoni in Philly. Even this, please go to them. They're still providing amazing services despite their problems with leadership lately. Um, and they all form part of providing services. So look that up. It's a lot harder if you're far away from major city, finding the meaningful supportive provider, but that is essentially a problem for all trans people. Which brings me to the idea that if you work in the health services, if you are a health provider, be it not just a doctor, but physician assistant, the nurse practitioners, try to become more trans friendly, try to have more trans patients, reach out to trans groups, especially if you're in rural areas that are underserved by trans friendly providers. And that alone, you can start talking of being sex positive and so on, and be able to talk about it to your patients, because few things are worse than non-trans affirming providers, and even worse sometimes than the bigot with an MD is the guy who doesn't know anything about it. And I think I'm gonna open the door again to the dog to calm her down a bit. But first off, that is some of the stuff we can do about it, both in terms of people with low socioeconomic status, or the margins of the margins, and so on. But yeah, I need to step out to open the door, the bedroom door for the dog, to see if she doesn't bark at the cat. Just a second. I'm gonna mute myself. Hello again. I like it that I have a backdoor people that will put that screen when I have to step out and do embarrassing stuff like that. And I sincerely hope the dog is not barking at the cat while the cat is staring at her like, what is wrong with you? Uh yeah, fun grassroots organizations that are doing street-based work. If you are in the process of deciding grants and so on, that's where you donate to. That's another thing we need to do. Fund grassroots organizations that are doing all of the hard work of prevention, of harm reduction. And when I mean grassroots organizations, I don't mean uh the paternalistic, let's pretend we're helping people when in reality we're being condescending. I mean the organizations led by and for people who are in the front lines. So yeah, I like that. That's another shout out I can give to this for Natalia. So yeah, with that, unless there are more questions and I see that we are having relatively few viewers, I will open in. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I know. We need to do this. And I'm basically giving the whole shout out to all these organizations because that's who we need to be funding. That's who we need. That's the people who truly are doing the work at the front lines. And that's the people whom we need to be constantly, those of us who are here in DC, who have the privilege of being inside the Beltway and doing that national work at the policy level. That's who we need to be backing. That's who we need to be thinking about every time we go into the meetings with policy heads, or maybe next year in the White House when we have an administration that the idea of being invited to the White House is embarrassing. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Oh, hey, I killed a fly. What do we do about transgender youth, getting transgender youth off the streets? If I remember correctly, 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. And in that sense, I'm thinking of how do we do that? That we often talk, we need to change. First off, the underlying problem is non-supportive families. A supportive family can mean everything and make all the difference for a young trans person to get off and not end up in the streets and not end up at risk and so on. What does that mean? It means that we need to change the culture so that we stop having families kicking out kids, so that we stop having families hurting them, and so on. And I'm thankful for the questions that keep me talking to fill out this hour. Thank you. Because otherwise, I can't do the work alone of making a fool out of myself in front of people. So, what does that mean? It means that we need to change culture so that we don't have more people being thrown out of into the streets or being forced to flee. It also means we need to work on schools. I sometimes talk about pipeline to failure, kind of stealing it off the topic of the pipeline of the school to prison pipeline, which is that already in school you're being bullied and abused and discriminated, not being allowed to use the bathroom and so forth. And the system is essentially pushing you to drop out of school, to not be able to complete school, or for that matter, to end up in jail or whatnot if you're a person of color and so on. It is already pushing you to a mental health crisis and trauma that will not let you finish, be it at school or at college. It will push you into a situation where it will be harder to get a respectable above board job that is legal and not having to resort to the underground economy to survive, to criminalized forms of making a living to survive. It means that we have that at that point you're more likely to be targeted by law enforcement and have a criminal record and thus not qualify for a lot of programs or it'd be even harder to get a job more likely to end up homeless, and so on. So the entire system, pretty much from when you start realizing that you're queer in your puberty all the way onward, is designed to try to screw you over, for to be to be crude. And that requires some foundational transformational change of society. Transitional housing does need to take that front seat. Yes, Natalia, you're right. So what does that mean? It means that we need to fund greater programs around homeless youth. We need to fund the organizations that provide mental health services to homeless youth. We need to make it easier for trans youth to access health care, like mental health services and so on, without parental consent, to access services without that parental consent, much like we talk about access to abortion by youth who have uteruses without parental consent. We need to do the same around trans issues, trans mental health care, trans puberty blockers, counseling, and help to try to get you outside of an abusive situation and into a situation where you can still thrive. And I can keep on going. But but at the very end, all of the need won't change till we get to the point where families aren't kicking kids out. And that needs to get to a point where it is this taboo to be against LGBT people as it is to commit cannibalism, basically. That type of situation. So, yeah. And that also helps towards, again, the topic of the day, pulling back into it, the idea of ending the HIV epidemic. The more we can address people who are at risk, the more we're likely to do so from a genuinely intersectional perspective, because far too often we kind of have a vision of the suburban kid who is white and probably just gay or bi and not trans. And we need to start keeping in mind that not everyone is in that position. One little thing, small thing. How about making college available to all, basically? How about making college free and affordable? Then you might have fewer youth. Then how about making FAFSA and financial aid and student loans not dependent on parental income, and thus, if you don't have supportive parents, you can't attend college because you can't afford it. Those are little things that keep youth, at least in the case of those who can attend college, yes, make college affordable for all, make healthcare affordable for all. I can keep on going. Make affordable healthcare universal. Instead of for the rich, instead of the capitalist hellscape we have for healthcare right now. So yeah, that is another thing to think about. And also, when we talk about schools, like high schools and so on, we need to make sure that trans youth stay in school, that they are able to have a safe space, even if they don't have that safe space at home. Because, like, for example, when we talked about the pandemic, one of the most depressing aspects that we had one of the most depressing indictments of our society was when we were talking about how some of these kids might not get to eat a healthy meal because that's where it's at school that they get it, basically, if we close schools because of COVID. And I feel COVID-19 has only exacerbated those issues and is at risk of setting us back because more people are unlikely to attend healthcare, to attend their doctors, clinics, hospitals, and so on, because COVID is disproportionately impacting people of color, and literally a majority of the deaths are people of color in many jurisdictions, because it's disproportionately impacting people who are already discriminated against by the healthcare system, and I can keep on going with that issue. So yeah, that is another thing to keep in mind of how the pandemic is affecting us all, because not everyone has the privilege of a nice apartment and a high-speed internet connection from which I can speak to you all while my dog is barking. So yeah, that's another thing. Please keep bringing questions. I love answering them. I'm enjoying this dynamic right now. But yes, that is another thing that people need to do. So yeah, have questions, comment on Facebook. It's 5:45 p.m., so I wouldn't feel too bad if I were to close it out now and a bit early, since I know it's sort of close to the end of the night. But we will have very soon, today at 7 p.m., Marching for Change by Hope Giselle and Tatiana Williams, so don't miss that out. So yeah, now that I think about it, I should do at some point a radio show or something like that. But yeah, if you want more information of some of the work I do, look me up on Google. My Twitter is at Jovimi, Yovimi. And also, I have been published in the American University Journal of Gender, Social Policy, and the Law around disability and LGBTQ intersections. Should we focus on getting more young people in the government than their ancient relics? Well, given the passage of time and how people die of old age and so on, I don't see any other way to move about into the future, basically. So I guess that's how the world works, basically. So yeah. But yeah, with that, and we need to focus on who do you elect, basically. Like, we have some amazing new voices out there that just need the pushback, the push. Sorry, I'm writing my Twitter to my backroom people so that they can post it. At Javini, you can look me up, read my ramblings on the internet, and so on. And I am the senior policy at AIDS United, where I keep doing my work around the HIV epidemic. I am in the board of Equality New York, another great organization you should follow. And actually, that's the wrong handle. You missed the I at the end. I'm sorry to correct you on air. So yeah. So that's another thing to keep in mind. With that, I guess I will send you all off close to 6 p.m. unless people have questions. There's my Twitter handle. If you want it, if you want to follow me, I will see if that happens. And yeah, support trans people of color, support trans women of color, give them money, fund the organizations that help them and provide grassroots advocacy like HIBS. And if you donate to HIBS, tell them I sent you, basically. So yeah, talk to you all later. Thank you.